I guess let's do it. Yay, Paul.
Yeah, or hi, friends and heathens and minus JeGaysus. We don't have JeGaysus today. Welcome to the Unholy Trini-Tea. We are here to talk about Paul and how great Paul is and how much the Queen of Heathens loves Paul, the apostle in the New Testament. Isn't that right? Aren't you happy to be here?
So thrilled. No idea. For the record, I think I stated this in the last episode. I don't have a strong opinion on Paul, other than, why does everyone care so much what he has to say? But I'm interested to hear some perspective. Never tire of talking about Paul.
Well, boy, do I have a perspective. If that hasn't happened by now. As if you tuned in last week, you heard JeGaysus with some outright ancient Near Eastern slander. Just talking about how, Paul's just terrible and we should cancel Paul. I think there's merch now. So if you want to be wrong, you can buy JeGaysus' merch on the merch store and go check that out. But I'm going to have a fight with JeGaysus about this because it just needs to happen. Because if I'm going to be honest, I know that if you go amongst the interwebs, you'll find very quickly that Paul is not exactly everyone's favorite person when it comes to talking about the Bible. Everyone likes Jesus. People don't like Paul. Well, not everyone likes Jesus. But if you're going to pick one of the two, it's going to be Jesus and not Paul. I like Paul a lot. Paul was a big part of my education. Paul was a big part of my education in seminary. I took 2 years of Koine Greek. My second year was exclusively translating Pauline letters. That's letters that either are by Paul or are thought to be by Paul or his followers. So that's my Paul Tato.
Yeah, that's all I have to offer at this moment.
I'm here for it.
Put it on a shirt,
Yeah, exactly. That'll
okay.
be mine.
So maybe we can start with a little bit of just kind of background. So can you tell the people, Andrew, which books are actually thought to be authentically Pauline and which books are thought to be pseudo-Pauline?
So first off, it is believed that Paul wrote half of the New Testament, so 13 books of the New Testament. There are a few books that are widely believed to be written by Paul, and then there are a series of others that are not. Actually, I'm going to show you guys a book that I believe I have in here. Yep, it's right there. It's a fantastic resource for understanding the New Testament. It is not written in any way to convince you of anything. It is Evolution of the Word by Marcus Borg. Marcus Borg is not exactly what you would call a Christian writer. He writes on Christian things. He, in his own way, considers himself a Christian, but you know who doesn't? All the evangelicals that most of our listeners don't necessarily prefer. None of them think that he's a Christian. They think he's a heretic. But what I love about this book, and I don't know if you can see this, is it has a timeline on the cover of when each of these letters was written based on different Roman and Jewish historical events. And so it's a fantastic book. It's one of my favorite references for conversations like this. So the books that are in no contest, definitely by Paul, are 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, well, all the letters that make up 1 Corinthians. There's a number of them. Philemon or Philemon, Philippians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. Those letters are definitely Paul. There are two letters that are contested. Well, there's more than two letters that are contested. But two of the letters that are most widely contested are the book of Colossians and the book of Ephesians. Those are very debatable. Very similar Pauline language, really important theology. Depending on who you're looking at, they're going to say he did or did not write it. Reason being, it depends on when you date them. If you date them prior to the year 70, Paul died before the fall of the Temple of Jerusalem. So he died around the same time Peter did. Paul and Peter died around year 70, between year 65 and year 70. So these other books, all the other books that are attributed to Paul are either sayings that were kept by Paul that were assembled later by his disciples, or letters written based on teachings that he had said, or letters written based on teachings that people who taught Pauline theology would have said. Did that make any sense?
And yes, it did. And I think also something I probably say more often than I should, I think we have a very not odd, but a very modern idea of like plagiarism today. So like, back then, if you learned under someone, if you were taught under someone, they were your teacher, your master, whatever, oftentimes when you wrote, you would sign it with their name, as a sort of a sign of respect. It's like, I learned everything from my teacher. You'll see it with like Socrates and Aristotle and all of those people. Now, who knows? There's also just plagiarism that happened during this time, but it may well have been that it was a student of Paul or a disciple of Paul or whatever you want to call it that just then attached his name to it.
Right. There's actually 5 scores that people look at when it comes to the New Testament, when it comes to ancient writings. It's either written by the hand of the person, written by a scribe, but then the person dictating, written by someone who has assembled the letters and was a disciple or a student of, written by a community who favored that person, or written by someone who wants to defame that person. Those are the 5 rankings that people tend to look at. So we see most of those exist with Paul in the New Testament, except for probably that last one. Everything that is New Testament canon, with the exception of maybe 2 Timothy, is most certainly in those top categories. They are either written by Paul's direct hand, like the letter of Galatians. Paul actually says that. It's like, see, I'm writing this with my own hand. I'm not even going to wait for my scribe for you bitches. Like, I need to clear this up right now. Most of the letters that I just talked about are the second category, like all the letters that make up 1 Corinthians, all the letters that make up 2 Corinthians, all the letters that, so like Philemon and those other ones are all written by a scribe, most likely. Ephesians and Colossians are probably written by a follower of Paul. And then the other letters, every one of the letters after that being 2 Thessalonians, 1 Peter, 1 and 2 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Peter. All of those are probably written by people who either never met Paul and had heard about him, or had assembled writings and sayings that they put down in letters to other communities.
So never met Paul, had heard of him. So the Gospels?
Yeah, the clearest difference between a primary source and a secondary or tertiary source in ancient times is to look at the difference between the Greek of say 1 Thessalonians and say 2 Thessalonians. The difference between the Greek in those two letters is the difference between written by someone who claims to be the writer and written by someone who claims to be the writer and it wasn't them. The Gospels are closer to 2 Thessalonians in authenticity than they are 1 Thessalonians.
Interesting.
By good measure.
Okay, so let's maybe hop into the sort of what's going on in the background of Paul, more or less, right? So, like, what's leading up to his writings, what's happening around his writings. We should probably begin, at least, with the books that we know are Pauline. And then if we want to talk about the pseudo-Pauline epistles or letters or whatever you want to call them, then we can do that as well. But I think it might be clearest to sort of delineate there since we're talking specifically about Paul. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
And I think if I were to make like 2 categories instead of the 3 that I gave earlier, I would put Ephesians and Colossians in that first category because the teachings are so similar to what we see from Paul in other spaces. The Greek is different, but the teachings are very similar, depending on who you talk to. Yeah. So, and Ephesians and Colossians have become such fundamental letters when it comes to, more Ephesians than Colossians, but Ephesians has become kind of an example of how we treat Paul as a primitive voice when he was actually a progressive one.
Interesting. So I guess we should start maybe with some of the dating. So as far as I know, the letters of Paul, we see they're starting to be written around 50 CE, right? So about 20 years before the destruction of the temple. I'm sure there's a wide range there, but that's sort of when they start. I think it's interesting. It's always interesting to me to tell people that the letters that we have from Paul are actually the earliest writings that we have in the New Testament. It's just that because we put them in a different order, it's all jumbled in our brain that we think it happened in this very linear way. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's good. So what's really interesting is, like, depending on how conservative or liberal you want to be about it, we have 7 teachings from Paul and from the churches that are assumed to be Paul's churches, 7 of them, before we have the first gospel. And what's really interesting is that these communities that are reading the gospels are Pauline communities. They're communities that have been developed on Paul's teachings. And so everyone who was writing the gospels came from a Pauline community. And everyone that was reading the gospels was in a Pauline community. So in a weird way, the underpinning for everything we know about Jesus comes from Paul instead of the other way around. That's pretty interesting. So if we were to talk about it, the earliest letters are 1 Thessalonians and Galatians. Those are the two. Some would say 1 Corinthians is the first. That's not a popular view amongst scholars. It's usually 1 Thessalonians or Galatians is the first letter for a couple reasons.
Do you want to talk about those?
Yeah, sure. So for 1 Thessalonians, we see some documentation that's pretty early in circulation. It is also, we see the fewest events mentioned that have to do outside of the life of that church's theology in 1 Thessalonians. Galatians has some more developed church drama. That isn't the only reason, but that's a big reason that Galatians is later than 1 Thessalonians. But the reason that 1 Corinthians gets third place is because 1 Corinthians is not one letter. It's at least 2, if not 3 letters that have been mashed together and then were circulated. There's a couple of reasons. Paul is actually very good at staying on one plot point if you read the entire letter. He's really good at it. So when you read 1 Thessalonians, if you read the entire thing in one sitting, you get one message. And a lot of it has to do with, based on the end times, how do we handle death? That's what's the main thing happening there. Galatians, one problem. If anyone is telling you that you need to be circumcised before you're baptized, they should castrate themselves. Yeah, that's it. That's in the book. We skip over that part. That's some Def Jam comedy shit. Like, he goes hard in that letter. 1 Corinthians is not as clean as those first 2. It's a messy, messy letter.
It's not
it has at least a couple plot points. Because the dick joke. Yeah, that's good.
I mean, I had to make it. Like,
it was great. I'm happy we're here for it. So, 1 Corinthians, it's a messier letter. There's at least a couple plot points in it. It's most likely that this is a couple letters, and if it's a couple letters, they were assembled after the fact and then circulated. So, odds are they didn't assemble a couple letters and circulate them prior to the writing of 1 Thessalonians and prior to the writing of Galatians. There was better reasons than that, but those were a couple that don't require me to go into too much context as to why that ordering of 1 Thessalonians, then Galatians, then 1 Corinthians, all before year 60, between year 50 and year 60.
So as just like a fun fact, because I like the Romans, it's interesting to know that during this time, between 41 and 54, Claudius was the emperor. And so the empire was actually going through a big period of expansion. But then after that, in like 64, I believe. No, not 64. I'm sorry. Let me double check not 64. 54. The Nero comes into power. And we all know our best buddy Nero. So, like, that's also 64 is when the Great Fire of Rome happened. So there's a lot going on during this time period. And for those that don't know, Nero actually blamed the Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, even though a lot of people think that he intentionally set it in order to clear space for his sort of lavish building projects. So that's sort of the background that Paul is writing against, and I don't know how much we see that reflected in his writing. But definitely, if y'all have followed me at all talking about Revelation, Christians later would think that 666 or 616 was in reference to Caesar Nero. And then that was because he had a myth surrounding him that he was going to come back from the dead, effectively, because they thought he was so awful as an emperor. They saw him as the Antichrist. Anywho, well, that's kind of a tangent.
No, that's good. So like, this expansion is actually the bedrock of the first church drama, and we have that recorded in the epistles of Paul and the book of Acts. So one of the ways that we know that Paul is a progressive voice is because we know what kind of like drama he was up to in the first century. And he had some beef, some ideological issues with two other people, Peter and James. And this is where our education on intersectionality today could actually really help us better examine the Bible. And if I were to use language, I suppose what I'd like to say is, let's get our criticisms correctly. By looking at the kind of education we have today around certain issues, we can get our criticisms right about what is wrong with Paul. And there's plenty wrong with Paul. There's plenty wrong with Jesus. But if we're going to get our criticisms about these people in these writings correct, we need to examine them carefully. Paul, Peter, and James are great examples of people that are progressive in certain issues during their time and conservative in others. And this expansion of Rome was also not exclusively a trigger, but happened alongside the expansion of the Christian church. This is before Rome and the Christian church have united. They're still very much enemies at this point in time. But we see Paul, even in his greetings, making note of the Greek and Jewish contexts around him, or the Israelite context, I should say, because the word Jew was not universal yet for all followers of Adonai. So he says grace and peace at the beginning of all his letters. Charis, which sounds very much like hello, is a classic Greek greeting to say charis. Shalom is also a greeting in this time for Jews. So he is saying at the beginning of each of his letters, grace and peace. He is saying hello to the Greeks, hello to the Jews, in every single one of his letters. He's acknowledging a mixed audience.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about that for a quick second. I don't remember exactly when it was brought up. It might have been off camera at some point. But I think you mentioned a really interesting thing where in some of his letters, or all of them perhaps, Paul is very much doing, I don't want to say, that's not double speak, but he's talking to both groups, right? So like, or maybe if he's sending different letters, he's saying like, well, I know most of the believers here are Gentiles and most of the believers here are Israelites. So he's giving them like different instructions based on whether or not they're Torah observant. Am I remembering that correctly? Okay.
You are, yeah, absolutely. So there are certain letters, and this goes beyond Paul. When we look at like the letter to the Hebrews, that is a very Jewish convert to Christian audience, almost exclusively. All the imagery is tied to the Judean language, the Israelite language, or the Israelite vernacular of how they process their spiritual lives. The clearest example out of all Paul's letters where he's speaking to two groups and switches it in mid-letter, not mid-sentence, but mid-letter, is Romans. Because there are moments where he says absolutely contradictory things in the book of Romans. And that's because we should picture him standing on a stage performing. Well, not him. In this case, it would have been Phoebe, who is standing up there. It is Phoebe, isn't it? Yeah, it's Phoebe.
I think so. My girl.
Like, so the Roman letter was most likely delivered by a woman. It is the most complicated rhetorical letter, and by delivered I mean orally delivered and physically delivered. That's what's happening in this letter. And just in case I'm wrong and it's actually Junia, I'm going to say Junia delivered the letter right here. Junia delivered the letter. We think about these letters as written things. We should be thinking about all these letters as theater, because during this time, somewhere between 4 to 6% of the Roman world was literate. Almost nobody could read and write. The few people that could read and write are elites. Most of those elites are men. most of those elite men are not Christians or in these Christian circles to receive these letters. So what that means is that the best way to be educated is through public discourse, through debate, through speech, through compelling performance. And so all of these letters that we think about Paul, and when we sit in our rooms and we read them privately, they were never meant to be consumed that way. They were written with the intent that no one would ever put their eyes directly on the letter except for the person speaking in front of the audience. That's how they were written. And so when we see this, we should see a person standing in front of an audience addressing a mixed group in a controversial way many times. Like when Paul says that whoever thinks they should cut off a little should cut off their whole selves, saying if you want to be circumcised, just castrate yourself. Wouldn't that make you more holy? There are probably men in the room that are advocating for circumcision that are hearing him say that. When Paul is speaking ill of the traditions of Jews, but using Jewish language, using vernacular of the Second Temple Jewish religion of the time, it is most likely in a room to them. And then he is switching to talk about how the law should still not be erased, because he is advocating for Gentiles to understand that he's not advocating for their supremacy either. He's advocating for a mixed religion between the Gentiles and the Israelites and Judean people, which is the conflict of the first century church.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. So maybe let's get into, what do you think is the most common sort of miscriticism of Paul? That's not a word, but I made it up.
Yeah. I think the biggest criticism of Paul, that he was homophobic. I think that'd probably be the loudest one. And after that, it'd probably be a tie between him either being homophobic or him being misogynistic. Paul is usually characterized as either being one or the other. What do you think?
So, I struggle with the idea of homophobia in the first century, the same way that I would struggle with the idea of heterophobia in the first century.
Tell us why.
There wasn't a concept of those things. I know I've said this before, but I feel like it just gets missed so often. It's actually reading a textbook, I think it's a textbook, and it's called Roman Homosexuality. And the entire intro is the author saying that it's a stupid play on words because nobody would have had any idea what homosexuality was, so he could have named the book Roman Heterosexuality, and nobody still would have had any idea what the book was about. Because the way that the Romans viewed sex was this very different thing. And again, I know we've talked about this before, but Romans were incredibly concerned, Roman men, with being the penetrator in the sex act. They were incredibly concerned with their dicks, which, not a lot has changed, TBH. But they were incredibly concerned with this power position, effectively, because being powerful was what was most important, right? And you can see this in, Roman graffiti and all of these things where they are literally romanticizing being the penetrating partner with a younger, sort of more prepubescent type male. Now, the other thing, some of it is wild, but anyway, the other thing is that it just wasn't a matter of whether or not it was a male or female, right? It just didn't matter to them. You married a woman because you had to procreate with that woman, and because the woman really had no other had no other avenue to survival. And then once this boy sort of went past the prepubescent age and started maturing, then this sort of body type was not as idealized. So they idealized the sort of youthful, hairless, life.
Well, may I jump in there?
Yes, yeah.
I think, and I'm not going to make an argument that it is in any way worse for men, flat out. It's worse for women. It's worse for women, flat out. But for young men in this time, and really through any patriarchal structure, they also become fuel for the patriarchal lineage. So another reason is like if he's a viable candidate for passing on the lineage of the patriarchal power in place, then using him for sex is not as important as using him for lineage. And
Right.
that is also an ugly utilitarian nature of the patriarchal structure that we frankly America learned it from Rome. And we have that episode somewhere. So go listen to our
Sure
other stuff.
do. Yeah. I mean, but you even see, I mean, like, this is, of course, kind of an intense example, but, like, Nero fell in love with a male slave, made him his spouse.
Yeah.
Right, Sporus, and then forced him to become a eunuch, to put it nicely.
That was so weird. Like, if I, like, now that I've had you, no one can. Like, what?
Yeah, it's not surprising, but it is weird. I also read somewhere that the man had resembled the wife that he beat to death. Not the man, but the boy, man, child, whatever.
Oh yeah, because he was still a child when he noticed him in the fields.
Right. So again, I don't know if that's more like lore or if there's any actual like factual basis for that, but it is really interesting that like I'm trying to think of how to phrase it. Like, I think there's always this potential that like, was he really condemning this idea that didn't exist of homosexuality, or was Paul really saying like, hey, if you can't control your sexual urges, at least get married, and then you can do it with your wife. Also, that like maybe he had an issue with the fact that like, okay, you're sleeping with like really young kids, right? Now I don't know that for sure because like I know in that time period they had a very different idea of kids, but I can imagine. Maybe Paul feeling some kind of I'm just riffing, but feeling. Well, no,
you're actually tying into
Go ahead.
You're tying into a really interesting thing because one of the how can I say this well? So Paul as a figure in the first century going in, and his writings being really prominent in the second century as well. Before they're canonized going into the third and fourth, he is a figure that is a proponent of a more progressive religion. Progressive being one that transcends Israelites and Judean people, and one that invites in other cultures. One of the ways he invites in other cultures effectively is by providing space for his teachings to give rights to slaves and women. And by the third century, early third century, late second century, early third century, Christianity is not just being referred to as the way, but also as the religion of women and children. So what's really fascinating about this like cultural phenomena that Paul is pioneering is it is one that is being coined by the names of the people that have the least rights.
But not them slaves.
But let's talk about that, right? Like, so we have this, right? No, it's fine.
I've had a couple of weeks with slavery apologists, and I'm like, fuck all this noise. But
no, slavery bad.
Slaves bad.
When there is slavery, just say no.
Right, like. I know we did a whole episode that was called Quit Defending Slavery, but, like, for real, you fucking heathens, quit defending it. Like...
Yeah. If anyone offers you to smoke one slavery, just say no, kids. Because knowledge is power.
Don't do a slavery.
Don't do a slavery, not even once.
The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Okay.
Oh my gosh. I'm so glad all of this just happened. Okay. So there's this little letter, and it is very little if y'all want to read it. And it is probably Paul at his like most messy, bottom, sassy bullshit. Paul, if you read Paul as like the sassiest queen, you can get the context of where he's going half the time. Like, because he's just got that going on. Like, the way he hints in directions with his rhetoric make him sassy, make him sarcastic. He's easier to understand. Just pro tip, do that. We have this letter that, depending on which part of the country you come from, it's either Philemon or Philemon. And in this letter, there is this guy named Onesimus. He is a slave. In this letter, if you read it, Paul is equating his worth as an individual to the worth of the slave that he is sending back. And he is equating the worth of that. And then he says to the slave master, now surely you do not consider yourself above me, though you can, as I am your servant. And just to make sure that you are taking care of your servant, I'm going to visit you in the near future. Now, the context that we find later is when we get into the letters to Timothy. The pastor that is being put in place over Ephesus is Onesimus, this slave. Now, many scholars believe that this Onesimus is mentioned because it is made clear that Philemon made true on his promise and freed the slave. That it was like coded language that led to the freeing of the slave, that not only led to his freedom, but also led to him being the pastor of the most prominent church with the most prominent scribes, Ephesus. So that's an interesting thing. Like, so I'm not saying, now to be clear, Paul never directly advocates for abolition of slavery. Don't give him that pass. He never advocates for any subtle abolition or freedom of any slave that is not a Christian. He never says that. And for those that are still slaves, he says, obey your masters. So he doesn't deserve a full pass. But there is a weird thing happening here in a Roman world that has its entire economic structure built on slavery. And actually we do till today. The 13th Amendment allows us to arrest people and make them slaves, America. So let's not pretend we're above it all. But that's a fascinating little thing that's happening in this short rhetorical letter to this slave master. That's one of the letters that we know for sure came from Paul. I talked for a while, but that just makes me really excited because it's just so freaking weird.
Yeah. Well, and I think, so, like, stuff like this and being able to say, like, okay, Paul never did X, Y, or Z, so we're not going to pretend he was some, like, revolutionary abolitionist, but also saying that, like, there's something going on here. We don't know exactly what it is, but, like, it's an interesting thing to explore. And this is something I've touched on recently, is that, like, I feel now as an evangelical agnostic that I am able to love the Bible so much more than I ever did as an evangelical Christian, because I'm able to look at it and see what it says as opposed to what I'm told it's being said. And it doesn't have to fit one very neat, tidy narrative or timeline or whatever. It can be messy and weird, and it can not make sense, and I can have to wrestle with some things and be like, that seems really fucking weird. But, like, part of that is what makes it so interesting, because we're getting these, like, dispatches from the ancient world and trying to sort of put it all together and understand it in a way that just understand it. Anyway, there's no real point there. I just think it's interesting because I get people sometimes that are like, you just hate God and hate the Bible. And I'm like, no, funnily enough, I actually like the Bible way more now than I ever did, because before it was fucking boring. And it was like, why do I need to read it when you've already told me exactly what it says? There can't be any deviation at all. So, like, I guess I'll just keep reading this same shit over and over. But now it's just so much more interesting.
It is more interesting. And that's a funny thing that evangelicals do. They tell you what the Bible says and then tell you to read your Bible. It's like, do you want me to trust you on what you said it says or not? Like, that was your fundamental argument here, homie. What do you want me to do? When I realized that the vast majority of Christians were going to decide that I'm a heretic bound for hell, and I released myself from those communities, I allowed myself to read the Bible from a gray space, and that made things so much better. The closest thing to a ceaseless prayer in my life now is, what do I do with that? Like, what do I do with this information? Like, what do I do with these wrestling points of this text and that text? And, like, how does this all fit together? Why was this important to these people? And why does it have such an impact on my world? That is the closest thing to a ceaseless prayer that's part of my life currently. So, yeah,
beautiful.
It's a fascinating set of stuff. So, want to get into some nasty first century drama?
Do I ever?
That was convincing. Thank you. So we get this glimpse of this weird shit happening at this church called Antioch. Antioch is a really important church. A lot of first events take place in Antioch, and they're all recorded in this canon that we call the New Testament. What we find there is a couple of things. Number one, it is where Barnabas took Paul after finding him in his mom's basement. Oh, did you not know about this? This is a whole ass thing. Paul royally failed. Go ahead.
Okay. No, I was going to say, like, I know about Barnabas, I know about Paul. I'm missing the basement context.
Right. Okay, so...
was Barnabas the first incel?
Paul failed his first efforts to be a missionary so bad, he fled and went back home to Tarsus. Now, home, as an unmarried man, would have been wherever his mom lived.
Roger.
Dude literally went back to his mom's house and
his
stayed
like,
there sad. Yeah, because he fucked up his missionary work so bad. That's what Paul did. This is like a random fact, but it's true. There's this text that says Paul left, and after his leaving, the town experienced their first moment of peace. Like it's in the Bible. It's such shade. Like it's so funny. So Barnabas had to go to Tarsus to find Paul.
They were like, finally, that fucking fool shut up. Now we can all get back to our life. Like,
that's the exact context. I'm not making that up at all. That's exactly what happened. Like that's the drama that's happening in the Bible. I think it's hilarious because we treat Paul like this kind of like hero figure or this kind of villain figure. We never treat him as just royally incompetent, and he was at the beginning of his ministry.
Well, and also I feel like we often treat him as this stoic who sort of always has this confidence and is very sort of even-keeled and is, you know, goes on his mission and does whatever. So I think it's interesting to think about him just being like a bumbling idiot.
Isn't that nice?
Love it. Anyway, continue.
But yeah, that was like a whole thing. So Paul... he failed. He went back to Tarsus. Barnabas, who is a leader of the church of the time, we get a hint of him at the beginning of Acts. He gives a lot of property away, or he sells a lot of property, takes those funds, gives it to the church, and is one of the earliest beneficiaries of the early church. And he's noted in Acts as being so. So Barnabas goes, finds Paul, brings him to Antioch to learn how to do ministry. In Antioch, that's where we get the first tension between the Gentiles and the Jews. Paul is convinced that we need to expand space for the Gentiles to have room. So Gentiles being people that are not Jews, not considered the chosen people. This is a fascinating doctrine that I think we should all be a little bit more educated on. That there's this notion that these Jews who are the chosen people of God, the chosen people of Adonai, are that in some way Christ is a part of that and an extension of what God is doing. Paul says yes, and that is extended universally. That is extended also to non-Jewish people. The entire Ephesian letter is a treatise to suggest that even those that are not considered Jewish people are just as destined to be with God as Jews are. So, if anything, it's a letter of universalism and not a letter of Calvinism.
That's what I was going to say. I was like, sounds very universalist to me. But hey, what do I know?
Colossians and Ephesians are you know quite a bit, and I'm okay too. My first class of my second year of Greek was translating Ephesians and Colossians from the original language and with a team of people. Fucking awesome class. And what I learned is that Colossians and Ephesians is the loudest treatise for universalism that exists in the Bible. It is absurd. And it is centered around cultural inclusion of non-Jewish people into the kingdom of God. When you think about Paul from that lens, he doesn't seem like this woman-hating,
Stodgy bitch.
slave condoning. Yeah, he seems different, especially when you think about James, who is often considered the social justice person of the New Testament because of the letter of James. The letter of James is so good for social justice work today, but he was a fairly conservative, Torah observant Christian who believed that we needed to be practitioners of the Torah. But a lot of the social justice narratives we get from the Bible come from the Torah.
Okay, I just have to do a quick, aside. I was on Twitter.
Sorry, I'm getting long-winded. Please go for it.
This is just a funny aside. So I was on Twitter minding bigots' business, like I do, and I ran across this guy's tweet that was like, what the gospel is. And it was like, Jesus crucified and resurrected. That was it. And then he was like, what the gospel isn't. Feeding the poor, doing justice, taking care of, the needy, racial equality. And I was like,
motherfucker.
Have you read James? Dog, I come across the craziest people on Twitter, I'm not even gonna lie. And it's always these, reformed dudes. They're, reformed whatever. And I am convinced that reformed is code for I was a hall monitor in high school. That's all I can think. This kind of person that would tell me, I benched 275 when I was in college. Okay?
I have come to the conclusion, I'm with you. I think that reformed bros go, the spiciest thing about my life besides my mayonnaise is my title in Christianity. I go to reformed conferences.
Oh my God. Pastor, father, husband. And then they block me after one tweet.
I can't remember the last time I encountered a reformed person that wasn't completely illiterate when it came to the Bible. But and I mean that with all the greatest sincerity, because they'll treat every different type of literature like the exact same fucking thing. And when they do it, they destroy these cultures. They are recolonizing these ancient worlds with this whitewashed, air-conditioned armchair bullshit. And I'm so fucking tired. Deuteronomy 16.
Do you want to hear something funny? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes. And then I'm going to talk about Deuteronomy because I'm excited about it.
So one of these fucking dude bros, Deuteronomy, am I right? No. But one of these guys.
Deuteronomy. Go home.
Bye. So anyway, he said something to me and I lit his ass up. I was like, listen, Walmart, Paul Bunyan, I'm not sure if you can fucking read what I'm saying, but if you can read chapter books, you should check out academic sources. So then you might learn something. And I went on to tell him that his barber hates him. He needs a new haircut. And I think that he called me a chick. So I was like, maybe this chick is going to pay a visit to your dad and give him a child that he loves. Anyway, after I did all of that, I was like, bye. And then for some reason, Josh and Dan McClellan, hopped in to my defense to be like, she's right and you're an idiot. And the reason I bring all of this up was because he was like, basically, I don't care if you have a PhD. I'm not really into that critical reading. And I was like, Dan, Josh, you don't care about their... So you're right. They're like, well, the Bible says in plain King James Version English. So I don't feel bad at all. And I reveled in Dan and Josh taking him to task. Anyway.
That has to be so much fun. That had to be so much fun.
Because I put myself in the line of fire. I never ever ask anybody else to jump in. But when they do, it is glorious because these men just get first of all, obliterated and embarrassed. They get their feelings hurt. And then they just get their hopes and dreams dashed by smart academics that are you actually don't know jack shit.
I'm going to have to just follow you around Twitter just to have some fun. That's what I'm going to have to start doing.
Anytime. Love it. Okay, sorry. I just wanted to tell you that story because you were saying they have to be the most ignorant biblical people of all time, and yes, they are.
It is so frustrating, and don't get me wrong, I don't mind ignorance because I've been ignorant the majority of my life, but it's when you're ignorant and loud and and confident. Like,
loud, confident, and wrong. Like, loud, confident, and wrong. Just shutting the fuck up is free.
What I learned about, like, these Hebrew scriptures, what I learned from the Torah, what I learned from the prophets, changed the trajectory of my life when I actually started taking this shit seriously and encountering that there was writings about people that were savage in their criticisms of culture, also advocating for better agribusiness practices and better understanding of how officials should be elected and all this stuff. And what I've watched Christians do in this majority culture context is decide whatever their whitewashed, anti-Semitic, nationalistic world loves must unite with the gospel, and therefore I'm going to read it from that lens. And I'm going to read Jewish texts. I'm going to read the Hebrew scriptures from this bad white nationalist lens of the Christian texts to filter these Hebrew scriptures through. And it fucks me up so bad because they've missed the vast majority of this book. They've missed like the whole damn thing that this book claims. This library of libraries that we call the Bible is filled to the brim with some of the most amazing things I've ever read. But if the thing you're most familiar with is the Pledge of Allegiance instead of the Torah, you're not going to understand what the Bible's doing. You're going to be lost the entire fucking time. And it's so exhausting.
So we've talked about why some of our criticisms of Paul are bad or misinformed. How can we better criticize Paul? How can we criticize Paul in a way that's productive or
that's good.
Contextually accurate even?
Love that. Let's do it.
All right.
Ready, steady,
set,
go.
All right. So we have talked about ways we should not criticize Paul, or perhaps misinformed ways that we do criticize Paul, based on maybe a faulty understanding of what was going on contextually and historically, and also reading the text with our very, very 2022 eyes. So how do we criticize Paul in a more productive way? How do we add to conversation? How do we criticize him in a way that is fair and historically accurate and could potentially lead to productive discourse? Go for it.
Yeah, that's good. So I think one of the best ways to criticize Paul is also to let him speak on what he wants to speak on for his time and not let him say anything else. There are two things that I think we do about... So I think I need to put like gutter bumpers on this bowling alley of how we criticize Paul. On one end, I'm being reductive, but I just need to do this for the sake of discourse.
Sure.
I think the classic atheist argument is that Paul is primitive. That he has, like misogynistic things to say, he's pro-slavery, whatever. And then I think the progressive evangelical argument is that either we should throw Paul out altogether, which I don't think is good for this discourse, but also, no, if we think about Paul in this way, then he can speak to everything that's going on. And I think both of those are fundamentally false. Paul was writing to try and... He had a message that he thought was worth saying. Let's let him say that thing, and then let's put him to rest. Let's stop making everything that he has to say about today's sermon analogy, and let him be what he wanted to be. He wanted to be somebody that spoke against an exclusivity culture that prioritized kosher living. I shouldn't say kosher, because that really wasn't a structure at the time. I apologize. He wasn't prioritizing the way the Israelites and the the Judeans were living as the way to be like Christ. He was prioritizing a space that was advocating for other cultures.
Right.
That was advocating for a different way of being for both Greeks and Jews. Let's let him say that. And then let's not pretend he has anything else to say. He only gave us... Now, granted, he wrote definitely 6 letters. He definitely wrote 6 letters. Let's let him have 6 important things to say for his time that can maybe apply today, and then let's look at other sources and other places for everything else.
So something that I wanted to just sort of toss in here as a thought or idea was something that a friend brought up to me on, again, Twitter, because I sort of put a question out, like, why does everyone care what Paul thinks? And so, of course, you had a lot of people coming in and hating Paul and loving Paul and whatever. Now, I just wanted to touch on this quickly because I thought it was a really interesting perspective. I don't know how much basis there is in history, but whatever. So my friend Jeremy says, Paul's encouragement to let women learn was new. His limiting their ability to teach was only because they had been denied access to education their entire lives, and to throw them out in front of all of these people would only reinforce the idea that they were incapable. And then he goes on to say, I don't think it was ever meant to be a permanent injunction against teaching by women. I think a lot of Calvinists actually missed this point on election entirely, namely that God doesn't play favorites. And I thought that was a really interesting thing that I had never quite thought of that way. So shout out, Jeremy, what up? But that kind of blew my mind a little bit. Like, I was like, I never considered that.
What that's it. So for those of you at home playing the home game, if you want to do a deep dive, I would recommend looking up biblical hermeneutics. And when you look up biblical hermeneutics, find your way to what is called trajectory hermeneutics. It's a way of reading. It's also called redemptive movement hermeneutics. It's a way of trying to see, to locate the voices in a text and then see them on what direction they were pointing in, and then figure out what it would look like to continue moving in that direction. Now, I think the edges on having Paul say more than he ever intended to say. But there are multiple times, if not the primary of the time that Paul is speaking, he is pointing in a direction that gives more freedoms, includes more people, and allows for greater rights and authentic living. Yeah. That's the direction that Paul tends to point in. What we tend to do is we tend to, from where we stand, point backwards in time at Paul and suggest we need to move back to the way he was advocating from where we are. Paul's not writing from our context. And so he's never suggesting a regressive life. He's always suggesting a progressive one.
And
when
I
he
really think that... Sorry.
Go for it.
I just really think it's interesting because, again, if you talk to Jewish people, they see the Torah and all of their writings as a living, evolving document to be wrestled with and to figure out how you can apply this to your life today. Most of them, the majority, I mean, maybe there's probably Orthodox Jews, I think, that would say, like, no, we need to go all the way back to 100%, like, following the law word for word. But most Jewish folks that I've encountered have said that, like, it's actually their responsibility, their divine task, whatever you want to call it, to wrestle with the text and figure out what it means to make the world a better place here and now. And this text is evolving, and it's meant to sort of teach you over time. And I'm trying to remember, when I was speaking to Mark the other day, he was saying that there's a sort of a tale where two rabbis are disagreeing over a point in Torah, and a third rabbi comes to them and says, both of those are God's holy word. Meaning that, like, it can mean these two different things, even if they're conflicting, because the most divine thing you can do is wrestle and try to understand this text and apply it to your life in your quest to make this place better. Because that's very much what it is. At least from my understanding, Judaism is very much trying to make the here and now, heal this place, as opposed to waiting for some ultimate sort of redemption. It's a twofold thing.
So what's fascinating about that right there, what you just said, is Paul does that. Paul is, first and foremost, he's a Jew. He is a Pharisee. And he does that what he does is he takes that language of wrestling and puts a Neoplatonist lens on it, and he gives new language we've never seen in other writings. There's a phrase in the Bible that Paul uses. Well, he does this a bit, but there's a phrase in the Bible, it's really beautiful, that Paul uses that you don't find anywhere else. And it is in Ephesians, and it says that we are to open the eyes of our heart.
Oh my God, I feel like that's a worship song.
It is. It
sorry.
is. I know, and that changes it, but like, it's evocative imagery. And like, it translates perfectly in that direction, to open the eyes of your heart. That's a wonderful thing. And in Romans, a letter definitely written by Paul, it says that we are called to the renewal of our minds, to think about things in a renewed way.
Right.
And he is talking to Christians about this. He's talking to the Jewish and the Gentile Christian communities in that time. So if there's one thing that's applicable about Paul today, if nothing else, it is that we are called to rethink the way we understand the world around us. And if that's all we take away from him, that's compelling.
Right. Absolutely. Okay.
That feels like a pretty good point, actually.
I think so, yeah. But if you want to hear more of that conversation with Mark, it is going to be Mark Lucher is a Hebrew Bible scholar that I interviewed over the weekend, and we talked about the social context for the prophets and the composition of different books in the Bible, the dating of it, and how to build bridges with people who read the text differently than you. And it will be up on my Patreon in the next probably week, but then in a couple weeks from now it will be up on YouTube as well, and it's a really fascinating conversation. I had a great time. And so if you want to hear more details on that, you can check that out.
If you want to find me, I'm almost exclusively on TikTok because I am in a creative funk and I don't know what to say on the interwebs at the moment. But you can find me on TikTok.
On Twitter.
I'll hop on Twitter. I'm going to follow the Queen of Heathens around and just throat kick Theo Bros. But yeah, you can find me on there, and you can also find me on this podcast, and if you haven't checked out our other episodes, you really need to check it out.
Yes. You can find me in hell. Just kidding. So, if you have tuned in for the last 2 weeks and you saw me and JeGaysus talk about cancel Paul, and then you tuned in and saw me and Andrew talk about Paul, awesome. You should tune in next week for the most serious debate of all time, where Andrew and JeGaysus will go head to head. I don't know why my thumb wants to do that on one side. I make no promises, but I think it will be entertaining. Same time, same place. Bring your Paul opinions. And then keep them to yourself. Just kidding. You can comment.
No, it should be fun. I'm going to start some casual TikTok beef with JeGaysus, and if you watch this, then you now know I'm just kidding.
Who's gonna win? What is the prize? I don't know.
I mean, it's going to be me, but that's fine.
But again, what is the prize?
The pride, bragging rights. I like that.
All right. Well,
how about this? One of us has to buy the other person some random Amazon purchase that they request.
Love
that
it.
is the tune of no more than $10.
What about me, though? Just kidding. Yeah, no, that sounds like a good prize. Okay, let's wrap it on up. Y'all know where to find me, Queen of the Heathens, on TikTok, Queen of Heathens on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube now, apparently. Make sure that you like and subscribe to this channel.
You can find me at red_sage1, literally everywhere there is internet.
If you don't know where we are now, what are you even doing?
If you don't know me by now,
you ain't never, ever, 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 ever gonna know me. All right, bye.
That'd be a great funeral song, actually.
I mean, it's true. So true.
It's technically
and
true.
On that note, over and out.
Bye.
Bye.